24 minutes to 9, and it is that time of the week. Colin Peacock is here with the Midweek Media Watch. Hello, Colin.
How you going?
I'm going all right. Are you grumpy at me for using a lazy, thematically appropriate segue song? Because
No,
you know how you get
not at all.
you know how you get grumpy when people do an interview about financial stuff and then follow it up with "Money" by Pink Floyd?
I don't get grumpy. I just let it wash over me. I don't sweat the small stuff. Although if you're talking about music, you do not want to call your band Foregone Conclusion on the recommendation of Wallace Chapman.
I didn't think so.
He's stitching you up.
He said it so quickly. What?
It's the name of the fictitious spoof covers band fronted by David Brent in the kind of remake movie that followed The Office, who cashes in all his redundancy money and blows it all on recording horrible singles with a band called Foregone Conclusion. So yeah. Wallace Chapman is stitching you up. He's stitching you up, mate.
He's stitching me up. Wallace? Never. All right. Thank you for that, by the way, Colin. Thank you.
Here to help.
For your wisdom. Let's talk media stuff. We should begin. Yes, let's begin with RNZ, a story about RNZ. The Media Council has upheld complaints about a very distressing story published online back in May. This was discussed at the time on Midweek Media Watch. What's the story here? Yeah,
complicated story, complicated ruling, so yeah, do kind of bear with us. But this was a story published in June on RNZ's website. The headline, pretty confronting: teenager starves to death alone in emergency accommodation. A very sad story, and it carried warnings that it dealt with eating disorders, disturbing content, and 17 complaints were garnered by this in the end, citing all sorts of principles under the Media Council's codes, but accuracy, fairness and balance was the main one, but also privacy, comment, in fact, a whole range of them. Some people even cited subterfuge and conflict of interest because of the possible or rumoured involvement of anti-trans lobby groups or activists that might have had a particular agenda, because this story did involve a transgender person. So in the end, it was only on the first principle, accuracy, fairness and balance, that a majority of the council members upheld complaints against the story. But they were at pains to point out it was a very unusual set of circumstances. The person at the heart of this debate had died, and there was disagreement over the stability of their gender identity. And right at the start of the decision, they said at the outset, "We note the sadness of the situation and extend condolences to friends and family." So that's a sign of just how sort of sensitive it was.
Yeah, I mean, Can you sum up what the story was all about? Yeah,
so very sad death of a transgender teen, as we said, who had many problems in their young life. So the story backgrounds those. There was sexual abuse from a very young age, the onset of anorexia at about 12 years old, 10 hospitalisations and a compulsory treatment order at the age of 13. So later, Alex, the teen, became estranged from parents and others and ended up living in emergency accommodation, in contact with several social agencies, which is another complicating part of the story, and died in 2023, effectively starved to death, suffering from anorexia, among all the other issues they were confronting. And the story that RNZ published was partly because of all those difficulties, mainly but not exclusively based on the account of the parents who believed that these multiple agencies had failed in their care of Alex. And I mean, if you look at it on the site, it looks like a kind of RNZ news story, although it's kind of long. But to me, it felt like reading it like a kind of magazine article about, a very confronting, challenging story about someone who we don't yet know, and whose parents are kind of in a bit of a limbo while this coronial inquiry goes on.
Yes. Well, the death of a teenager is at the heart of this, and naming and gender identity was also a big part of the controversy and the complaints as well.
Yeah. So under RNZ's own kind of rainbow community reporting and content guidelines, as they're called, which are now actually under review, RNZ adopted the name for Alex as V or Vanessa, because those were the names the parents adopted. So that became a kind of point of controversy. The parents claimed in the story that their teen had later abandoned a transgender identity, but this was disputed after the publication of the story by others who knew or interacted with Alex. And David Farrier of Webworm, on his Webworm online outlet, published accounts of people from online forums which appeared to sort of contradict this or cast doubt and show that the relationship with the parents was very strained. The Herald's David Fisher wrote a follow-up piece too. So this was at the heart of some of the formal complaints that were received by the Media Council. That was one that was favourable to the parents' point of view, effectively, and that there is another side to it revealed by some of these interactions of Alex before he died, and that effectively the account and the choosing of the name that the parents preferred denies or expunges the part of the chosen identity. So the council said, look, considering the complexity of this and the different views, they did not think that the selection of the naming issue was any breach of principles. And RNZ kind of repeatedly said in their responses to this that it was the care and welfare of Alex and how it might have failed. That's really the key to the story, not gender. But the council, when they ruled on this, they said, look, while it was about a death from anorexia was the cause of it, gender was a key distinguishing element, said the Media Council, of the story and needed to be dealt with in a balanced, careful way. And they say the parents' views on the gender issues and their belief that gender was a symptom and not a cause of Alex's tragedy were a significant feature of the narrative in RNZ's story. So they ruled it really was an irrelevant factor.
How did RNZ respond broadly to the Media Council about these complaints?
Well, they kind of restated that it wasn't fundamentally about the gender issues, but about the treatment and care of a seriously ill person. And they said, look, really we're considering a couple of things here. One is, did RNZ publish an inaccurate and balanced story, given that it was largely based on the testimony of the parents? And the other was, look, reliable information available about the teenager's preferred name. Once that becomes available, should RNZ have rewritten the story or adjusted it or even taken it down? So RNZ said, look, the majority of the article is about the onset of Alex's illness and the efforts of others to help. The circumstances that led to their death in the motel as well. RNZ said they spent months researching the story, gathering documentation, and made the point that a range of voices, not just the parents, were given the opportunity to comment, even if they didn't. So RNZ was convinced, they said, that the story was robust and they had confidence in the fundamentals of it, so it stayed up online where it remains today.
Although it did change, didn't it? The story changed after publication and other information coming to light, which was not initially published or aired by RNZ.
Yeah, so those online forum messages we mentioned that David Farrier and the Webworm blog published, those were online forums Alex had contributed to. RNZ said, look, for privacy reasons, the teenager was identified with these other names. Since publication, we realised this teen has now been publicly identified as Alex, and RNZ has updated the story and the language. But the Media Council said complainants felt that these follow-ups and amendments weren't really accurate. They believed that what was out there in the public domain from these online forums, contradicted the parents' accounts, particularly that claim that Alex was interested in detransitioning. Another complainant said that, the follow-up article quoting the sources would have been appropriate, or the story should come down if the statements couldn't be backed up. But RNZ said the existence of this online forum was unknown to RNZ at the time of the publication. And even if they had known, there's then the ethical question, which was actually one that you raised at the time when this was first discussed on Midweek Media Watch back in June, that publishing material from a private platform hosted by an underage person who has now died is a tricky one. And RNZ said it took a number of weeks to confirm the bona fides of some of those who provided that information. Once the accuracy of some of that was established, the story was adjusted to use the name Alex where appropriate. But they still say, RNZ, it did not fundamentally change the core of their story.
So the Media Council upholds complaints on the principle of accuracy, balance and fairness, although I think that there were a couple of dissenting members. What aspects of the story did they use to uphold those complaints? Well,
and then they said, look, the lack of balance in the initial article could have been corrected as complaints and information came in after the initial publication. So the majority, this is to quote from their ruling, the majority of council members felt that RNZ should have realised there was another side to the story. Information based on Alex's online posts emerged and a flood of commentary from people within the trans community who thought it was unbalanced and unfair. Once the messages were in the public domain, said the Media Council, it should have become clear that there were a variety of options open to RNZ to express that voice and provide balance following its publication. So later in the ruling they said, doubled up on that, when new information provided an insight that was missing in the original story, it would have been fair for RNZ to have acted on it. So I think effectively the Media Council are saying they think the wrong editorial decision was made. But as you mentioned there was some dissension. So two council members disagreed. They felt, the two members, that it was within RNZ's editorial discretion to limit this important story to the circumstances of this particular teen's case. they felt the focus on the article was clearly on the parent's story and that that was enough.
All right, that's interesting. All right, there was also this complaint at the time that anti-trans or gender advocacy groups were involved in pushing this story or getting it published.
That was raised by some people in saying this might be evidence of, the principles on subterfuge or conflict of interest, but the Media Council said not so. But they did say, and this is interesting, right at the end of the ruling, the council believes RNZ should have been aware there was a wider agenda at play and another side of the story that needed to be told, particularly when further information emerged after the publication of the first story. And they also said earlier in the judgment, this is again quoting directly from their ruling, the fact that the story was brought to RNZ by a group that is regarded as having an anti-trans perspective should have alerted RNZ to the fact there was a wider agenda at play. Council members considered it might have been wise for the sake of transparency to include in the story that the family was being supported by this group, that's the family of Alex, and that the group had brought the story to RNZ. So what they seem to be saying there is maybe the unfairness or the lack of balance could have been ameliorated if there was some sort of sidebar or additions to the story indicating that there was this sort of context going on. But as we said, RNZ's view limiting the story fairly strictly to the circumstances of Alex and the people that knew Alex.
All right, so what happens now then?
Well, RNZ's published a story summarising the Media Council's ruling, and that ruling has also been added or linked to it to the story which they continue to host on the website at rnz.co.nz. Stuff published a version of it as well, and that's the usual when a council ruling crops up. That's basically what they're obliged to do to engage with the spirit of the whole process. But RNZ has published a response that takes issue with the fairness and balance ruling.
Which is unusual.
Yeah, it is. So this is in the name of Mark Stevens, who's RNZ's chief news officer. He said, and I'm quoting here again from the statement, "We cannot be expected to balance first-hand perspectives from people directly involved in a story." So there he's referring to, the parents of Alex. There was the owner of the motel where Alex died who had first-hand contact and did speak to RNZ and knew Alex. Possibly others as well that were spoken to but don't appear in the story. So to balance those first-hand perspectives with information contained in verified documentation with second-hand sources, which is a reference really to the online stuff that was published by Webworm and shared by others who had concerns about RNZ's story. Mark Stevens says, others may choose to publish information, but RNZ is obliged to make its own verification of this, and it is unreasonable and potentially dangerous for the Media Council to judge RNZ on the standards and ethics of others. And then another interesting addition to that, efforts were also made to follow up the story with alternative perspectives, but those are not pertinent to the substantive article the council was considering. So I guess there he's saying, the council is considering their story as it was published, and they are obliged to respond to that when responding to the formal complaints and communicating with the council. So, he ends by saying, we await coronial findings into this case. And indeed, when that happens, we will hear the social agencies whose staff would have interacted directly with Alex, who we have not yet heard from because they say they're unable to talk about this while the coronial inquiry is going on. However, they could if they wanted to. That's not in their interest, perhaps, to do so. And the council makes that point and said RNZ cannot be blamed for the fact that no one from these agencies is as yet prepared to speak about that. So that's another point made in that ruling. So, the story will definitely re-emerge once those coronial findings come out. But it's been a couple of years. It's a long process.
All right, sticking with RNZ and changes proposed for music and arts coverage here at RNZ, which we've also previously discussed on Midweek Media Watch. They were confirmed today.
Yes, they were. So RNZ's reviewed its music and arts coverage because they say a couple of reasons. They want to reach more audiences across more platforms and be more efficient, but also it's to do with what they say, the reduction of RNZ's funding in this year's budget. So it's a tightening of the belt as well. The big one, the youth platform Tahi, closing after 4 years. The final podcast episode will be on Thursday, the 6th of November. Other changes at the movies after many, many years, fronted by Simon Morris. That show is going. The final date hasn't yet been confirmed. The Sunday Sampler show 1 hour program, that's wrapping up, but the Sampler that you hear within Music 101. That continues on 101 and on its digital platforms. And Culture 101 on Sundays from 1 o'clock. That's going to change from 2 presenters to 1 as per the proposal. And they say this is to bring the program into line with its sister show Music 101 and to boost production of the show. They are hiring a dedicated producer for that program. In fact, there's, I think, 3 new roles that will exist, and they'll be multimedia production, but it will definitely change the nature of Culture 101.
All really interesting moves, and we could talk at length about this, but I'm aware that we don't have too much time. Perhaps we should just talk about... I mean, Tahi's maybe one of the biggest moves. And RNZ, top line, RNZ struggling to attract younger audience. This is a thing that RNZ has suffered from the past and continues?
Yeah. Well, it's an ongoing thing. I mean, back in 2020, the efforts to create a whole youth network kind of collapsed into Tahi, and it hasn't worked. So John Hartevelt, the interim head of content at RNZ, said the youth market's difficult and it just hasn't reached the target audience to the extent that would justify continuing to fund it. That's what he said there. I think there are 4 roles related to that are going. But other media companies have struggled with this too, and all their efforts have been short-lived. I think NZME had Kick, Katie Harris and Rosie Gordon did a good podcast, In the Loop.
That was a good podcast.
Yeah,
I
it
enjoyed
was.
That one, yeah.
Yeah, and that, when I say short-lived, maybe that's unfair because it did have a bit of a run. I mean, I guess maybe that was part of the strategy when you were at Stuff. And
yeah, well, I mean, Newsable, the podcast that
Newsable,
I co-hosted at Stuff with Imogen Newsable was certainly a youth-focused podcast as well.
Yeah.
Difficult market to...
Yeah, it is. And it's interesting what John Hartevelt says here, the expansion of international platforms like YouTube and TikTok has made it hard to support dedicated youth channels. We're able to reach younger audiences by making content freely available on those. So maybe it's a case of, if you can't beat them on a bit of a budget, maybe just sort of join them. I think that's part of the theory.
Yeah. But RNZ is hiring more multimedia producers to create arts and culture content as part of this review, which, well, how do you read that? Is this kind of more of the shift from radio to digital that maybe the Sutherland Report would frown upon?
Well, possibly. I don't know if it frowned upon that in particular, but that's one of the criticisms that RNZ had, neglected radio whilst putting all its efforts into digital, or that some of the products for digital didn't work all that well on radio. But I guess this is an effort to create content that works on both. But if you take, say, for example, Culture 101, you have 2 presenters down to 1 for quite a long program. And when you have 2, they'll have different specialisms. But they also say at RNZ this is part of getting a wider range of voices, not just presenters. It's easier said than done. You can appoint a multimedia presenter and give them a freer hand and rework the content that way. But still, if you've got to put out, a lengthy radio program, as you'll know, you do a few hours each night. It takes production effort, and I think it's difficult initially to do both. Yeah, it's quite a transition.
All right, let's finish with a bit of sport. We spoke last time on the Midweek Media Watch about the media copping a bit of flack for not featuring the Black Ferns enough during the Rugby World Cup in the UK, and you've had some feedback on that, Cole. Yeah,
I have. In fact, a newsroom got in touch because we had was it Brodie Kane and I don't know his last name. Jordan.
How to Dad?
How to Dad.
How to Dad, yeah.
Has he got a last name? It's not How to Dad, is it? No, of course he does. But you know who I'm talking about. And they were both slamming, in particular, TVNZ for, in fact, Jordan, How to Dad was, Brodie Kane a bit more widespread about what she called just the MSM not doing the right thing by the Black Ferns. So I had one sports broadcaster from one of our newsrooms. I won't narrow it down because they wanted to remain anonymous, at saying, I understand people are upset by the lack of coverage, but across the media as a whole, I feel everyone's doing the best they can with the opportunities they're given. Those having a crack online might be joining a bit of a media pylon. And he said, we in our newsroom, that I won't name, we're doing our best to cover it. New Zealand Rugby aren't always as helpful as we'd like them to be, trying to get our videographers on the ground with the Black Ferns, but media managers have come back and said we're too busy on some days to provide footage or interviews. Said the All Blacks have become very good at filming all of their press conferences and stand-ups, so we're able to make use of it, but that hadn't happened here. And he pointed out, he sent me a schedule to say, actually, there were 4 non-media days for the Black Ferns in the week, and that was one of the criticisms of Brodie Kane. On these off days between matches, there wasn't a lot to keep the momentum going. And they said, look, this has been like that through the tournament. We've tried to do Zoom calls and stuff. That just hasn't been an option. And, sent me the schedule. I had to look through it. And, true enough, there were large kind of holes where they were doing other things and engaging with other, stakeholders and foreign medias and sponsors and stuff like that, and not actually available for the media. So that did cast a different light on what I felt was actually a bit of unfair criticisms, because I felt there was a fair amount, but those who felt it was lacking, maybe there's a reason why in terms of the media management of the team over there in the UK.
And finally, I spoke on Monday to Jamie Wall about politics and sport colliding at the Ryder Cup, and you think this was actually quite a big media event?
Yeah, well, mainly, you spoke to Jamie and you spoke to him about that Black Ferns thing as well. So I feel like I'm just doubling up on your Monday night sports slot. But
long may it continue.
Well, it's good. It's just dovetailed content, isn't it? We're getting with
it's synergy. It's synergy, right?
That's the one. But what Jamie was saying was this was kind of politics and sport colliding and the Trump influence. And actually, Trump was there, right, at the Ryder Cup. Yeah. And I'm not a golf person, not interested in it much. But over the weekend in our house, we had a golf adjacent relative staying, so we had some of it on. Has everyone heard that cringy stuff, the fan misbehaviour, the bad chant?
Yeah, Rory,
but not the rude one, but the one that got the Heather McCann. If we've got 30 seconds, we can fade it out at will.
Go for it.
Okay, so this is how they tried to get respond to the raucous chanting of the pro-European golf supporters. It didn't really work for the Americans.
Here come the lyrics. Scotty Scheffler. All right, hold on. I'm going to let the forefathers try and teach you that.
We're going to try this one more time. If it doesn't work, we'll do a DeChambeau one.
Yeah, it doesn't really work. I don't know who the guy with the heavy voice comes and said, it doesn't really work, let's try this one. And they tried it again. It just didn't work. But I thought it was brilliantly summed up in one of our favourite podcast second captains, Ken Early.
Like 20 years ago, it would be Vince Vaughn and Will Ferrell, like kind of sending up those guys.
Yeah.
And this is, I suppose, it's like their golden age for that era, the pre-woke 2005 era. But like back then, it's cool. Those guys were considered assholes.
It's cool to be a jock again, Ken. Yeah. A boorish jock.
You can't now satirise it.
Yeah, that's the world now. Colin Peacock, thank you as always. Appreciate it.